Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Why are so many Americans celebrating the murder of a healthcare CEO?
We are following breaking news. We have new video of Luigi Mangione's arrival at a courthouse in Pennsylvania. That's where we were anticipating an extradition hearing for the 26-year-old Ivy League graduate.
Arrest is generating backlash online, not against the accused murderer, but against the McDonald's where he was spotted.
Liberal wackos are treating suspected killer Luigi Mangione as a folk hero.
Well, I think it's terrible.
The suspected shooter. Does that tell you anything about how people
I think it's a terrible thing. I think it's really terrible that some people seem to admire him.
Luigi Mangione has now been indicted by a grand jury in the murder of United Healthcare chief executive Brian Thompson. Thompson was gunned down on the sidewalk outside his Manhattan hotel on December 4th. Prosecutors allege Mangione targeted him because he was the head of a healthcare company. But for many, more shocking than the crime itself has been the reaction from the American public. I'm David Smith. Today on The Big Story, we're digging into why Luigi Mangione is being celebrated by many as a folk hero, and what that says about the health of American political culture and public discourse. Ali Breland has been writing about this for The Atlantic. He joins me from New York City today. Hi, Ali.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for making some time. So, to start, just your thoughts, please, your general views on the reaction we've seen to the killing of the United Healthcare CEO. Are you surprised by what we've seen?
Truthfully, I was like a little bit surprised to see the sort of like amount of people that were pleased with his death. I think that there was like some precedence. I knew that some people were going to react this way. As soon as I heard about the news, I immediately thought about how people online reacted to Henry Kissinger. And that there was like a sort of contingent of people who were like politically left that were like, yeah, this guy did a lot of bad things and it's good that he died. And so I kind of expected that from the United Healthcare CEO. What was like not completely surprising, but more surprising to me was that like there was this outpouring of quote unquote normies, sort of like median people who are not like extremely politically active, who were also applauding this in a way that I'd only seen sort of very online, very politically focused left-wing people. I just like heard anecdotes from friends who were like, people in their workplace were kind of making jokes and laughing about it.
Yeah, I've seen too some parallels drawn to the Kyle Rittenhouse situation, but I think maybe a key difference there, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that was a lot of people who were maybe a little more checked in on political issues, more politically active, hardcore right-wing people who live and breathe partisan politics. But here, as you say, one thing that stuck out to you really was how normal people seem to have been touched by this. Do you see any parallels with the Rittenhouse thing, or is this something a little bit different than that?
Yeah, I think it's pretty different, and it's sort of useful though to compare it to Rittenhouse. There are sort of examples of things like Rittenhouse, and then the reaction to Daniel Penny killing the homeless person in New York, and then in both of those instances, the reaction to the people that both Rittenhouse and Penny was like very divisive and like sort of fell neatly along political lines. Like if you were right wing, you thought it was like good with some exceptions, and then other people either thought it was bad or didn't have strong opinions about it. With Brian Thompson, the United Healthcare CEO, dying, and with Luigi Mangione allegedly killing him, it transcended sort of like political lines. There were people who were sad about it, people who reacted, especially like sort of among the more like elite apparatus of things, like people like Matt Walsh and Ben Shapiro and Laura Ingraham, large like American political conservative influencers, tried to sort of like criticize the reaction of people being like, this is actually sick. And then in Walsh and Shapiro's case, their online commentators, they have comments open for people to comment on their work, and a lot of their fans were responding by saying that they actually disagreed with Shapiro and Walsh, and that they thought that this person that they either deserved to die or that they didn't feel bad about their death.
Yeah, and have you noticed that in your own life as well? Sort of that Venn diagram of opinion is a little bit more mushy in the middle than we have seen in the past. Are you seeing a mix of opinions in your circle of peers, regardless of political leanings?
Yeah, I mean, if anything, I would say it skews more towards like people saying that they don't particularly feel bad about it, or even people sort of egging it on. I think that that's like, if anything, like the more dominant response I've seen.
Your thesis in the Atlantic piece, which is great, I would recommend the listeners go check it out if they can, is essentially that the Luigi Mangione story may be evidence that political violence is becoming mainstream in America. Why do you believe that?
The first thing that was like really interesting that we've talked about right now is the response from the sort of masses, the sort of median person was already like actually like maybe this is kind of okay, and he became a folk hero, not along political lines, but like a bipartisan folk hero, arguably. The second thing that I thought was interesting is like when we came to know and understand who Luigi Mangione is and who we think he seems to be a fairly normal person himself. If you think about political violence in the United States in like the 70s, you think of groups like the Weather Underground, who were this sort of very radical and like well-read group of radicals who were reading political theory. They had like very aggressive niche thoughts. They were out of step with most of the population. Even if people had like sympathy with what the Weather Underground was doing, they were not normal people by any stretch of the imagination. I don't mean that in a good or bad way. I mean that they were just truly different than the average American. Luigi Mangione came from a wealthy background. He went to an Ivy League college. He's different in that regard. But in terms of the media he was consuming, stuff like Joe Rogan, following people like Edward Snowden, AOC. He was just following like very popular, well-known people. His Goodreads shows him reading, for the most part, very like normal books and just engaging with the world in a very normal way. And it like seemed to me like he was this weird case of this political, like this person doing an instance of political violence, but he wasn't like a normal political actor. He was just like kind of a normal guy. And so it was like this weird symmetry between the median person being like, this is actually a good thing to do, or I'm okay with this, and then the shooter themselves being a normal person. So it like indicates that the radical political act of killing someone is not something that's confined for like Weather Underground people who are reading political theory, but it's like for guys who are just reading bestseller health improvement stuff or self-improvement stuff. It's like an affair for everyone now.
So here we are, December 16th, while we're recording this, and it's been almost 2 weeks since the actual shooting happened. And it's been long enough now that the reaction to the story has become a part of the story itself. Would you say there is a predominant opinion that has emerged, or do you think that this is polarizing people?
I mean, yeah, it certainly feels like from just like looking at analysis about statistical or data from like what the responses are, it feels like a dominant response is, I don't know if this is the majority response, but this is like the most visible response is like, this is permissible. Like people feel squeezed in America. They don't feel, I guess, bad about a healthcare CEO dying because they see the healthcare industry as this particularly like sort of pernicious and aggressive industry that extracts a lot of value out of Americans and makes their lives substantially harder in a unique way. And so like, I feel like that's been a dominant response. I don't think that everyone agrees with that. I'm sure like I've come across people who certainly don't agree with that and have different perspectives on it. But it does feel like that's like the most sort of like visible and salient one and the most like noticeable one.
Yeah. I like the demarcation, I think, between the most visible response, the dominant response, maybe not the majority response. As an American, how does that make you feel? That the dominant response was a man has been murdered, but because he happened to be the CEO of a large healthcare company, it's kind of justified. How does that make you feel? What do you think that says about the broader health of American political culture and public discourse?
Some part of me kind of thinks it's concerning, and not in a sort of like moralizing way in that like people are right or wrong to think about this in this way, but in that it does signal like that there is so much tension deep within like American society over these kinds of things that people feel as though either violence or the threat of violence is now potentially like one of the only viable solutions to reconcile just very like bad sort of contradictions in the American system. Like healthcare is something that people have been extremely pissed about in the United States for like a while now. It's like very common now, and again, bipartisan, for people to talk about how absurd it is that in America, like if you don't have a lot of money and you need potentially like life-saving medical care, and it's very expensive and it's out of network, that you need to like set up a GoFundMe sometimes, or that you need to go bankrupt. I have friends with multiple friends that have incurred at least 4 to 5 figures of medical debt that they have to deal with on a personal level. And it's just like, it's something that like, even if it's not affecting you directly, it's so in the water that people around you feel that way. And so even are dealing with it. And so even if you can see why people would react this way, even if you don't love what it means.
Do you think that might be why so many people maybe aren't holding up this suspect, Luigi Mangione, as a folk hero? Certainly that's one side of part of the more extreme reaction. Some people are actively celebrating the murder of this man, which is concerning in and of itself. But do you think part of why so many people aren't immediately cringing back from that reaction is because it's an issue that touches everybody? I mean, everybody seems to have a story of a healthcare system that has failed them or a loved one at some point. How universal is that hurt, that trauma for Americans?
It's a very normal thing, unless you're really rich, to kind of like have an understanding and an awareness of, and to feel like the system is like not sort of like working for people like you, even if you're not directly dealing with it.
How do you feel about how public leaders have handled this part of the story? How healthy do you think the discussion is about why so many people are leaning towards saying it's at least somewhat justifiable that this person did what he did? President-elect Trump has addressed it. Other leaders have addressed it. What do you make of that discussion right now? Is that happening in a healthy way, or do you get the sense that people in power are hoping this might go away before they have to address it in any real significant way?
The impulse of not everyone, but many with power, is that it would be ideal if things resolve themselves or sort of blow over, as opposed to people having to expend their political capital to handle them. And there's like obvious exceptions to that, but I think a lot of people do wish that's the case. But yeah, I do think that some people like do seem to understand that this is not just like a one-off instance, and that there is a feeling that will like continue to exist regardless of what happens, and a sort of a pent-up frustration that exists across like the country because of this. It's not just about this instance. It's about like what people are signaling that they're open to now. It's about people saying that like, I'm potentially open to different avenues for violence if we don't resolve these kinds of things through the democratic process. And I hope that like people in power understand how dangerous that is, and like try to sort of work to mitigate that, so that like people are no longer open to violence in the same ways. Political violence is a norm for trying to carry out and effectuate change is like not a very good society. Like no one wants to live in that, even if you're okay with what happened to Brian Thompson.
What do you think the emotion is behind some of this reaction, this overt celebration of a murder? What is the driving emotion? Is it desperation? Is it depression? Is it rage? Is it a feeling of being left behind, a feeling of helplessness? Could you put your finger on that?
I think that there is like a swath of the country that thinks that there's a class of people that don't care whether or not they live or die. And I think that that feeling is like a sort of symmetrical response, in that these people are like, well, I think that this upper echelon of people don't care about whether or not I continue to exist. And so if they don't continue to exist, I feel the same way. I think that's like what that's an expression of.
Yeah, okay. I can see that. Very interesting. Well, thank you so much, Ali, for joining me today and sharing your perspective on that. It's a story that we're watching closely here north of the border as well, and we'll continue to follow the developments. Hopefully we can chat with you again sometime. Thank you again.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Again, that is Ali Breland. He is a staff writer at The Atlantic who's been writing about the Luigi Mangione story, joining us from New York City today. And that is the Big Story Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. A quick reminder about the Seeker app. If you haven't downloaded that yet, it's a great new listening experience that we have for you. The Seeker app, radio, podcasts, all in one place. One handy app for all your listening needs. It's free. It's available on the App Store and for Android on Google Play. It's spelled Seeker, S-E-E-K-R, Seeker. Seek your sounds. I am David Smith. Until next time, thank you for listening.